The year is 64 CE. Through the narrow, winding streets of Rome, a woman is being paraded, completely exposed, her skin smeared with filth and marked by violent gashes. Thousands upon thousands gather, their voices a thunderous chorus of savage anticipation as iron shackles drag her closer to the Colosseum's towering gates. And believe me when I tell you this, what she's already endured is merely the opening scene of a horror you can barely fathom. What I'm about to walk you through will completely overturn everything you believed about Roman greatness. By the time we finish this journey together, you'll grasp exactly why historians for centuries have desperately tried to keep this chapter locked away in the shadows, and why even today some refuse to acknowledge it in their teachings. I'm going to expose 3 devastating truths that will stay with you long after this video ends. First, we're diving into how Rome transformed the act of execution into a grotesque form of sexual spectacle. Second, you'll learn about the particular transgression that would seal a woman's fate to this unspeakable horror. And third, I'll show you why the most powerful men in the empire, the emperors themselves, not only showed up to witness these atrocities, but sometimes became active participants. But here's the piece of the puzzle almost nobody discusses when they talk about ancient Rome's darkest practices. If you're ready to confront the raw, unfiltered truth about humanity's most disturbing tendencies, go ahead and subscribe right now, because what unfolds from this moment forward will fundamentally alter your perception of ancient Rome, and perhaps force you to question uncomfortable parallels in our own world. You think you understand Roman cruelty? You've heard about gladiators clashing in mortal combat, right? That was child's play compared to what I'm about to reveal. The true nightmare was specially reserved for women who had the audacity to challenge the empire's authority. Transport yourself to Rome's golden age, somewhere between the 1st and 3rd centuries CE. This is an empire commanding half the civilized world, constructing architectural wonders that still inspire awe, establishing legal frameworks that influence our justice systems to this very day. By every measure, this should represent the absolute peak of human civilization. Yet underneath those gleaming marble monuments and eloquent declarations about virtue and honor, Rome had engineered something far more sinister than straightforward execution. They had transformed sexual degradation into a weapon of state-sponsored terror unlike anything history had witnessed before. Here's the thing about Romans. Ending someone's life wasn't sufficient. The empire required something more powerful, something that would reverberate through every alleyway, penetrate every home, and invade the nightmares of anyone who might consider defying their authority. These public killings weren't simply about delivering punishment. They were elaborate performances, meticulously orchestrated productions engineered to shatter not merely flesh and bone, but spirit, dignity, and the fundamental essence of what made someone human. Let me share what the history books conveniently glossed over. Rome didn't just execute women who threatened their control. They methodically destroyed them through the most intimate, humiliating violations imaginable, converting their final moments into pornographic spectacles for the entertainment of the masses. And here's the crucial detail. This wasn't chaotic, random brutality. This was calculated psychological warfare, perfected across generations, refined by emperors who understood that the mere threat of sexual humiliation could keep an entire civilization in check. The most chilling aspect? The crowds absolutely loved it. Men, women, entire families with young children would flood the arenas, eagerly anticipating the moment when women would be stripped bare, violated and subjected to prolonged torture before death finally came. But everything I've described so far, that's just scratching the surface. Because that parade through Rome's streets, that was merely the prelude to something infinitely worse. Stay with me, because what happened once they reached the arena will make everything else seem like an act of mercy by comparison. Picture yourself standing amid the packed streets of ancient Rome. The stench is overwhelming. Unwashed bodies pressed together, decaying food scattered in gutters, and something else hanging heavy in the air. It's fear mixed with a twisted sense of excitement. The massive crowd is growing restless because they know exactly what's approaching. Then it reaches your ears. The rhythmic clanging of iron chains scraping against ancient stone, growing louder with each passing second. The crowd suddenly surges forward in anticipation as guards appear, hauling a completely naked woman through the forum's center. Her alleged crime? It might be adultery. It might be treason. It might be nothing more than rejecting the sexual advances of someone with power and connections. This is what Romans called damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts. But here's where your stomach should turn. Before she ever encounters those animals, she must survive something arguably more devastating. The Roman poet Martial documented eyewitness testimonies that historians deliberately kept buried for centuries. His writings describe how the frenzied mob would hurl human excrement, putrefied vegetables, and jagged stones at these defenseless, exposed women. But even that doesn't capture the full horror of what they endured. The guards commanding this procession would force the condemned woman to halt at strategically selected locations throughout the city, and these stops weren't arbitrary. She would be made to stand naked outside temples where she once prayed, directly in front of homes where her family members lived, through crowded marketplaces where she previously conducted her daily business. What was the purpose behind this calculated route? Because Romans had mastered the understanding that obliterating someone's dignity carried more devastating power than simply snuffing out their life. They weren't just eliminating an individual, they were systematically erasing her entire existence from the community's memory. Martial's accounts describe one woman who instinctively moved her hands to cover her exposed body. The guards deliberately broke her fingers. Another woman collapsed, attempting to escape the crowd's leering gaze. They yanked her upright and forced her to continue walking no matter how much she struggled. But here's the detail that should send ice through your veins. Families weren't just permitted to attend these degrading spectacles, they were actively encouraged. Roman parents routinely brought their children to witness these processions. They branded it as education, claiming it taught the younger generation about consequences for defying Roman authority. Even more disturbing, the condemned woman's own blood relatives would frequently join the mob, throwing stones at their daughter, their sister, their mother. Why would family members participate in such brutality? Because refusing to take part in the public humiliation meant they risked suffering the identical fate. And those guards orchestrating this nightmare, they weren't simply following orders handed down from above. They received specific training in the art of psychological torture. They knew precisely how long to pause at each location to maximize the emotional trauma. They understood exactly which parts of the body to expose for maximum degradation and shame. But that agonizing march through Rome's streets, that was merely the opening act. What awaited these condemned women inside the arena's walls would make everything you've heard so far seem like a merciful alternative. Don't leave yet, because what I'm about to reveal in the next section will disturb you on an even deeper level than what you've already witnessed. The arena holds secrets that will force you to confront the darkest capabilities of human nature when power goes completely unchecked. The massive arena gates crash closed behind her with a sound that echoes like thunder. 50,000 Roman citizens fill every seat, their roars of excitement indistinguishable from spectators at a modern sporting event. But what's about to unfold has nothing to do with lions or skilled gladiators battling for glory. This is about transforming a human being's last moments on Earth into a pornographic display designed for mass consumption. Here's the truth that historians spent centuries trying to conceal. Roman executions were never designed for swift deaths. Women condemned to die in the arena were compelled to act out mythological scenes of rape and violation before their lives were finally taken. The executioners would costume them as legendary figures from ancient stories, Europa being violently seized by Zeus disguised as a bull, Leda being attacked by the swan. But these weren't symbolic theatrical performances with actors pretending. Roman authorities would actually use animals that had been specifically trained to sexually assault these women, while tens of thousands of spectators watched, cheered, and treated it like afternoon entertainment. The historian Cassius Dio preserved the trial and punishment of Empress Messalina in disturbing detail that makes modern readers recoil. When she was convicted of adultery, though in reality her crime was threatening the emperor's grip on power, they subjected her to every form of degradation, that Rome had perfected over its brutal centuries of existence. The process began with her being stripped completely naked before an assembly of the empire's most powerful senators. Then they forced this woman of former nobility to crawl on her hands and knees across the sandy arena floor while spectators rained objects down upon her defenseless, exposed body. But even that represented merely the warm-up for what followed. Here's the element that makes your blood freeze in your veins. The Romans had developed a specific terminology for this form of torture, supplicium. It wasn't categorized as simple execution. It was the methodical, deliberate destruction of a person's humanity, their identity, their very soul, before finally granting them the release of death. They would parade in animals that had undergone specialized training for sexual violence. Bears, bulls, horses, all of them conditioned through brutal methods to assault human beings, while crowds of families sat in the stands, consuming food and refreshments as if watching a theatrical comedy. But here's what nobody wants to acknowledge about the crowd's participation. The audience wasn't passively observing these atrocities. The spectators were given voting power over which torments would be inflicted next. An upturned thumb signaled approval for continued humiliation. A downturned thumb supposedly indicated preference for a quick death, though that merciful option rarely materialized. Roman mothers would actually point out specific torture techniques to their young daughters, explaining in explicit detail how to avoid suffering the same fate. Roman fathers would describe the condemned women's screams to their sons, framing these lessons as education about power, control, and the consequences of defiance. The emperor's private viewing box was positioned to provide the optimal vantage point, and that wasn't accidental. These spectacles transcended mere entertainment. They functioned as masterclasses in imperial dominance, broadcast live to demonstrate precisely what awaited anyone foolish enough to challenge the system's authority. And the most haunting detail that will stay with you long after this video ends? Some of these women remained conscious even after the animals had finished with them. The bloodthirsty crowd would actively demand that they be kept awake and aware for the final act, being slowly dismembered piece by piece while fully cognizant of every excruciating moment. Yet there existed one category of woman who faced an even more terrifying fate than anything you've witnessed so far. The story of the Vestal Virgins will reveal depths of cruelty that make every other horror seem almost merciful by comparison. Now imagine the most revered, untouchable women in the entire Roman Empire, the Vestal Virgins. These priestesses held the sacred responsibility of maintaining the eternal flame, the mystical fire that Romans believed kept their entire civilization alive and prosperous. They wielded more influence than most senators, commanded respect from generals, and existed above the ordinary laws that governed common citizens. They were completely untouchable, until suddenly they weren't. When a Vestal Virgin faced accusations of breaking her sacred vow of chastity, Rome confronted a seemingly impossible dilemma. Executing a holy priestess might provoke the wrath of the gods themselves, potentially bringing catastrophe upon the empire. But allowing such defiance to go unpunished could shatter the foundation of imperial authority and invite widespread rebellion. So Roman authorities engineered something more terrifying than any public execution yet devised. They created a punishment so psychologically devastating that it haunted Roman nightmares for generations after. Here's exactly what they did to these sacred women. First, they stripped the accused Vestal Virgin completely naked before the assembled Roman Senate, every single senator forced to witness her humiliation. But they didn't rush this process. It was conducted slowly, ceremonially, while senators engaged in lengthy debates about her fate. She would stand there completely exposed, shivering from cold and terror, for hours upon hours. But that represented merely the beginning of her nightmare. The historian Pliny the Younger documented what happened to Vestals during the reign of Emperor Domitian in letters that were deliberately hidden and suppressed for centuries afterward. He describes how they would beat these sacred women with iron rods until their skin split open and bled, all while keeping them fully conscious through every agonizing moment. Then came the most horrifying component of their punishment. They would bury them alive, but not through any ordinary burial. They would lower the condemned Vestal into a specially constructed underground chamber that contained just barely enough air to keep her conscious for days, sometimes weeks. They would leave her with a single small oil lamp, a few pieces of bread, and a small container of water. Not enough provisions to sustain life, just sufficient to prolong the agony and extend the torture as long as biologically possible. The chamber walls were deliberately lined with sharp, broken pottery shards, so if the desperate woman attempted to claw her way to freedom, she would shred her fingers down to exposed bone. Every single detail was meticulously designed to maximize psychological torture alongside physical suffering. Here's the detail that will absolutely haunt you. The underground chambers were acoustically engineered, so Romans above ground could hear the screams rising from below for days, sometimes stretching into weeks. And Romans would bring their entire families to these sites to listen to the agonized wailing, calling it a sacred religious ceremony. Pliny documents one Vestal who somehow survived underground for 18 consecutive days. 18 days trapped in absolute darkness, slowly starving, listening to her own voice echo endlessly off cold stone walls, knowing that nobody was coming to save her. But here's the most twisted element of this entire barbaric system. If by some miracle she actually survived the ordeal, they would declare it divine intervention, proof that the gods had preserved her life. And then they would execute her anyway, claiming she had corrupted the sacred ritual by refusing to die as intended. Emperor Domitian personally oversaw the design and construction of these torture chambers. He would visit construction sites to inspect the work, ensuring the acoustics would properly carry the screams upward so crowds could hear every agonized wail. He described this architectural innovation as theological engineering, using sound itself to demonstrate divine justice being carried out. But the most shocking revelation? Emperors didn't just design these systems, they made the torture intensely personal, and what I'm about to reveal will show you exactly how far Roman depravity could reach when absolute power faced zero accountability. Here's the truth that historians desperately don't want taught in classrooms. Emperors didn't merely attend these brutal rituals from a comfortable distance. They designed them, they refined them, they personally participated. They transformed sexual humiliation into their private entertainment system, funded by state resources. Emperor Caligula didn't just show up to watch executions like an ordinary spectator. He choreographed them like a theatrical director preparing an elaborate stage production. He would invest weeks planning every minute detail of a woman's degradation, personally consulting with architects, animal trainers, and torture specialists to develop innovative forms of human suffering never before witnessed. But here's what makes your blood turn to ice. He would extend special invitations to foreign dignitaries and ambassadors, forcing them to watch these spectacles. Representatives from Egypt, Germania, Britannia, all compelled to witness Rome's capacity for creative, systematic brutality. It functioned as diplomatic terrorism broadcast live, sending an unmistakable message to every foreign power. Historical records and archaeological evidence suggest Caligula ordered construction of a specialized arena beneath his palace where he could privately experiment with torture techniques before implementing them in public executions. He would test these methods on enslaved women, refining his techniques like a craftsman perfecting his trade. Emperor Nero escalated the depravity to unprecedented levels. He would actually dress himself as a gladiator and personally participate in the sexual assault of condemned women. The crowd would erupt in cheers as their emperor raped prisoners to death, proclaiming it divine justice being carried out by a living God. But here's the most terrifying revelation that should shake you to your core. This wasn't the behavior of madmen who had lost their sanity. This was official policy. Sexual humiliation evolved into Rome's standard diplomatic weapon of choice. When foreign queens dared to defy Roman rule, the empire didn't simply execute them. They broadcast their degradation across every territory under Roman control as an unmistakable warning to other rulers considering resistance. The historical consequences rippled across the entire. What we've explored together today wasn't the product of a few individual madmen who lost their minds. This was systematic. This was bureaucratic. This was socially acceptable torture, approved by the most educated, sophisticated civilization of the ancient world. And here's what should keep you awake tonight. Public shaming still functions as a tool of control in our modern society. We've simply updated the delivery mechanisms: social media mob attacks, viral humiliation campaigns, coordinated harassment operations designed to destroy someone's reputation, career, and mental health. The technology evolves. The platforms change. But that fundamental psychological impulse remains unchanged across millennia. The Romans convinced themselves they were the pinnacle of civilization while enthusiastically cheering for sexual torture as family entertainment. What comfortable lies are we telling ourselves today? What are we convincing ourselves is acceptable that future historians will judge as barbaric? Think carefully about this question. What entertainment are we consuming right now, today, that people a century from now might view with the same horror we feel toward Roman arena spectacles? What forms of public humiliation have we normalized in our digital age without even recognizing